these attacks on Palestine solidarity activism is an attack against all forms of activism on all the issues. So everybody should take this very seriously and take collective action to oppose this censorship, this marginalization, this brutal attack on speech that speaks up for Palestine and simply attempts to reveal the reality of the situation on the ground in Palestine. I'm not best to speak about the sort of legal aspects of this, but politically, it's a pretty draconian, drastic move that is trying to basically, discourage students from engaging in activism on the question of Palestine, detain this student, to begin the process of deporting them. All of these are basically raising the stakes, and sending a clear message to all international students, and indeed to all students in general, that there's going to be a heavy price to pay if you dare to speak up for Palestine. All of the Trump administration's talking points around this issue, and the pro-Israel lobby group, all the Trump administration's talking points around this case, as well as the Israel lobby group's talking points around this case, are entirely baseless, invalid, and purely political moves that are trying to silence and censor all speech that reveals the reality of the Israeli settler colonial genocide of the Palestinians. The idea that this is quote unquote pro-terrorist, and I mean, this is so silly that it doesn't even require any serious debate or retort, because it is not, these are not serious claims. They, like I said, they are purely political. And what the Israeli lobby and the US administration want to do is to put an end to academic freedom and free expression on the question of Palestine, because the reality of the situation cannot really advance their interests, which are imperial and settler colonial. So when these groups and these administrations, as part and parcel of the power structures of today, when they are trying to continue to unleash genocidal violence against the Palestinians, they know on some level that it is unjustifiable, that what they're doing to the Palestinians is unjustifiable. And since they're at war with that reality, they're at war with truth, they cannot win the argument on the basis of facts and logic and reason and justice and history. They decide to apply draconian legal measures to silence all attempts at revealing truth, reality, justice, and so on. That's how everybody should understand these efforts. Again, they're not serious arguments that you can engage with on a kind of dialogical level to try to understand where they're coming from and trying to reach a sort of a mutual understanding with them. You can't do this to arguments like this. You have to look at them for what they are, pure power plays that are trying to silence the voices of those who are trying to speak truth, reality, and advance justice and decolonization in Palestine. And this is part of a long, long history that has silenced Palestinians and the Palestinian story. This is not new, but obviously this is a pretty dramatic step the Trump administration has taken. And I think it will eventually have the opposite effect of what they seek. I think in the short term, it will scare international students. It will scare universities. We've already seen that. I think some people will be thinking twice before they speak up for Palestine. I think some scholars will hesitate to teach about Palestine, to research Palestine, and so on. But many of us will not, of course, especially Palestinians. We will not be silenced by this. We will continue to speak about Palestine. We will continue to research Palestine. We will continue to speak truth to power. And I think in the long term, many people will come to see these kinds of draconian measures and efforts as a kind of a pure, in the way that I described them, as pure political power plays, and people over time will you sort of fight back against this. Some quicker than others, but I do think that most people today are looking at this and saying, you know, this is not serious arguments that the Trump administration is putting forth. These are not serious arguments that the Israeli lobby is putting forth. These are blatant attempts to censor speech because it does not suit the interests of the powerful. And eventually that kind of thinking will come out in varied ways that are hard to predict at the moment. But I think in the long term, this will backfire. Well, in general, Palestine shows the hypocrisy of the United States. The United States proclaims to stand up for human rights, freedom of speech, academic freedom, the rule of law, justice, civilization, democracy, and so on and so forth. But we can see how all of these ideals fall apart when it comes to the US's position on Palestine. Let's be very clear. Without active US support, the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians simply does not take place in the first place. Israel is able to do the things it does to Palestinians. It is able to colonize Palestine precisely because of the US and what the US enables it to do. So I think the majority of people around the world see through the, fake image that the US portrays about itself to the rest of the world. And this is just another case that proves that the US does not really stand up for those ideals, that the only thing that they really stand up for is the generation of power and wealth, that is all that they are about, that's all that they have ever been about. And the more people see and understand that, the more that sort of liberal veneer of the U.S. empire continues to kind of fade away. And eventually people around the world, I hope, will come to understand that their aspirations for freedom, for human rights, for liberation, for democracy, for the rule of the people, by the people, for the people, is not something that can be achieved when there is something called a US empire that dominates this international order. People need to wake up to that fact and start to, gain their true independence from American imperialism, whether that be military or economic dependence on the US. But I do think that overall, this case and the US general position on Palestine is the one that reveals its true face more than any other case in the world today. So I'm not a lawyer and I cannot speak about this from a legal perspective, but I can speak about it more from a sort of social movement perspective. There is a trend that has been happening for quite some time now that is not just tied to the Trump administration. This took place under different administrations in the US. And this trend is one where the state is making it much harder for people to engage in unarmed, non-violent, disruptive action. Whether that disruptive action involves economic disruption or, disruption of social and cultural life, of political events, that kind of thing. These tend to be the ways in which people, press their claims against power structures in their society and try to challenge and change them for the better, is through this kind of disruptive action. The state has been busy for decades eliminating that ability of the people to take these kinds of disruptive actions. This is yet another example of that. And it's actually, we've seen over the last year or so, an acceleration of the state's power and states' effort to expand its power and eliminate the ability of people to engage in disruptive action. That will have consequences not just for the case of Palestine, but for all other issues and causes. Take for example, forget like the sort of this recent, extreme measure that they've taken, detaining individuals and deporting them and that kind of thing. But even, making it harder for students to occupy public spaces at universities. This is a crucial way of engaging in disruptive action, to disrupt the normalcy of the university's operations in order to make demands on the university. Well, guess what? Now that they have these abilities to stop that from happening, they're not going to just apply that to Palestine. Next time students want to, let's say, protest tuition hikes or some other, education-related issue within their university system, they will not be able to do some of these disruptive actions that are now being, made impossible by the state. So really, the safest response is to respond with great numbers. So I can't speak about this from a legal perspective and what kind of legal protections students and activists can and should take. But from a social movement perspective, we know that when you have great numbers acting in one specific way, the state is not going to be able to punish them all. So I think this is time for people to rally around and oppose the state with a strong collective voice. So there needs to be mass mobilization as much as possible happening to oppose this case and oppose the general suppression of Palestine solidarity activism in the US, Canada, and elsewhere.